Tonight, in this deep dive, we are exploring the quietest yet loudest space you will ever occupy. Your own mind, when the room goes completely silent.
Yeah, it is a space we all inhabit, but it's also one we are uniquely and deeply conditioned to avoid at almost any cost.
You pull into your driveway, you turn the key, the engine cuts out. The music or the audio that was filling the cabin just stops. And instantly, there is this heavy, almost tangible weight that rushes into the space.
Right, the engine is cooling, it's making that faint ticking sound, but the silence inside the car feels incredibly thick.
Exactly. Or maybe it's much later in the evening. You're sitting on the edge of your bed, you just took off your shoes, the last of your friends has left your house, the front door is clicked shut, and the fading laughter has settled into the floorboards.
Yeah, that exact moment.
In that fraction of a second, between the noise of the world and the reality of the empty room,
Yeah.
there's a pause. And we all know exactly what happens in that pause.
There's an immediate, almost instinctual physical reaction, a subtle tightening in the chest, a sudden creeping unease.
And then the hand reaches for the smartphone. It happens before you even consciously decide to do it. I mean, I know I do this. Last week, I literally sat in my car for 20 minutes in my own driveway, scrolling through an app I don't even like.
Wow, 20 minutes just sitting there.
Just sitting there, simply because I didn't want to walk into a quiet house. Your thumb is suddenly hovering over the glowing screen, desperate to check a message that you know isn't there, or to just start a video playing in the background while you fold laundry.
Right, anything at all to break the vacuum.
Anything. Because the unspoken whisper that creeps in during that pause isn't just boredom. You are suddenly caught in a silence that isn't really silent at all. It is loud.
It is so loud. And that experience is profoundly universal, and, well, we have to validate it right here at the beginning. That instinct to reach for the phone, that sudden heaviness when the noise stops it, is not just you being fidgety. It isn't simply a modern attention span deficit, and it certainly isn't a character flaw. What you are feeling in that car or on the edge of that bed is the raw sensation of the topic we are exploring today, long before we even put a scientific or psychological label on it. It is the raw, unbuffered encounter with your own unfiltered consciousness.
Which brings us to the actual concept. We need to define this because once you name something, it loses a bit of its power.
Yeah, absolutely.
Psychologically, what we are talking about touches on terms like autophobia or monophobia. In the simplest terms, it is the fear of mental solitude, the fear of being isolated with oneself.
But we have to draw a very hard line here between physical isolation and psychological isolation.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Well, you can be completely alone in a cabin in the woods, hours from another human being, and not feel this fear at all, provided you are, actively chopping wood or reading a captivating book or fixing a radio.
Because your mind is occupied.
Exactly. Conversely, you can be surrounded by thousands of people on a busy city street or sitting in an open-plan office and feel the crushing weight of it. This isn't about geographic isolation. It is a psychological current running beneath our conscious thought. It is the mind's reaction when it is completely stripped of external inputs, stripped of tasks, stripped of digital distractions, and stripped of our social safety nets.
Wait, if you're listening to this right now while walking your dog or washing dishes, you might be thinking, well, I'm not avoiding my thoughts. I'm just multitasking. I like being alone.
Right. People say that all the time.
But that's the catch, isn't it? You aren't actually mentally alone if you have a video playing. The screen, the audio, the task,
Yeah.
they are all pacifiers.
That distinction is the entire core of the issue. When the external world stops demanding your attention, your internal world takes the stage. And for many of us, that internal stage is a terrifying place to stand without a script.
Yeah.
The screen is just the pacifier. The real mechanism driving the behavior is the active avoidance of the internal narrative. We are terrified of being left alone with the voice in our own heads.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit. Because on its face, this feels like a massive biological contradiction.
How so?
Well, if our brains are literally built to think, if complex thought is our defining evolutionary superpower as a species, why does doing absolutely nothing feel so incredibly loud inside our heads? Why is the baseline state of just being so uncomfortable? It honestly feels like a design flaw.
It does look like a design flaw, right? Until you look at the architecture of the brain. To understand the loudness of silence, we have to look at some groundbreaking neuroscience, specifically the work of Dr. Marcus Rachel and his colleagues at Washington University.
Okay.
Around 2001, Rachel coined a term that fundamentally revolutionized how we understand the brain at rest. He called it the default mode network, or the DMN.
I've heard this term thrown around, usually compared to a computer setting. Like when you leave your laptop open, you walk away to get coffee, and the screensaver comes on.
Yeah, right, the screensaver analogy.
Yeah, but a screensaver is a low-power mode. It's the computer going to sleep. That's not what's happening in our heads, is it?
Not at all. And that was the great shock to the scientific community. For a long time, neuroscientists assumed that when you weren't actively engaged in a cognitive task like solving a math problem or navigating a maze or reading a map, your brain activity would naturally power down.
They just assumed it rested.
Yeah, they assumed the brain rested when the body rested. But when they started putting people into fMRI scanners, which measure blood flow to different parts of the brain to show where the activity is happening, and they told these participants to just close your eyes and do nothing, they discovered the exact opposite.
The brain didn't power down?
The brain was practically on fire with activity. Specific, highly interconnected brain regions actually ramped up their activity the moment the person stopped focusing on the outside world. We're talking about regions like the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, and the precuneus. Even at wakeful rest, the brain is running at about 95% of its maximum metabolic capacity.
95%
Yeah.
is sitting there.
Just sitting there doing nothing. There is this tremendous surging background activity happening the absolute second you stop focusing on an external task. That surge is the default mode network kicking into high gear.
Let's actually break those regions down, because I don't want to just throw neuroscience jargon at people without explaining how it feels. What are these parts of the brain actually doing when I'm sitting in my driveway?
Okay, so think of the medial prefrontal cortex as your brain's me center. It is the part of your brain that processes information about yourself, your identity, and your relationship to others.
Right.
Then you have the posterior cingulate cortex, which acts a bit like a time-traveling hub. It pulls up autobiographical memories from your past, and it helps you envision future scenarios.
So if we return to the computer analogy, it's not a screensaver at all. It's more like when you step away from your computer and the system immediately starts running a massive, heavy background antivirus scan, indexing every single file you ever created and updating the operating system all at once.
That is a perfect way to describe it.
It's burning almost as much energy as it does when I'm actively working. So what is the ultimate purpose of all this heavy lifting?
The purpose is constructing your reality. The DMN creates your internal narrative. It handles autobiographical memory, meaning it drags up that embarrassing thing you said at a dinner party 3 years ago.
Oh, I hate when it does that.
We all do.
Yeah.
It envisions the future, running simulations of what might happen at tomorrow's staff meeting. It evaluates social situations, figuring out where you stand with your friends or your boss. It is the part of the brain that essentially knits together your past, present, and future to say, I am me, and this is my story.
It's the archivist, the anxiety-inducing fortune teller, and the social critic all rolled into one. And when I'm watching a movie or engaged in a conversation, those resources are directed outward, right? They're helping me process the external story.
Yes, your DMN is highly engaged in comprehending external narratives. But the moment the external story stops, the DMN turns its massive 95% capacity processing power entirely onto you.
Which explains perfectly why it feels so loud. Because suddenly, you are the only subject matter left to analyze. The DMN shines a massive, high-wattage spotlight on your past, your future, your insecurities, and your identity.
And if we connect this to evolutionary biology, it makes complete logical sense why having a spotlight shined on your identity feels profoundly unsettling. Human beings are inherently social creatures. Evolution wired us to find safety, identity, and survival in groups.
Right, the tribe.
Yes, for our ancient ancestors roaming the savannah, being separated from the tribe wasn't just lonely. It meant extreme vulnerability. It meant exposure to predators. It meant a highly probable death. Isolation literally equals danger.
And we carry that ancient neural wiring today.
We do. When the external noise drops away, and you are truly alone with your thoughts, your brain triggers an ancient biological alarm system. It scans the environment, finds no social inputs, and whispers, you are separated from the group, you are vulnerable, you are exposed.
Even if I'm just in my bedroom.
Even if you are perfectly safe in your climate-controlled bedroom, the physical reality might be safe, but the psychological reality is that your nervous system is interpreting the silence as a dangerous lack of social anchoring.
The brain is basically panicking, saying, hey, where did everyone go? We need to evaluate our social standing immediately to make sure we aren't being cast out of the tribe.
Yes, exactly.
And that manifests as this creeping unease, this urge to grab the phone, to reconnect with the digital tribe just to feel safe. And because of the brain's negativity bias, which also kept us alive by hyper-focusing on threats, the DMN doesn't usually bring up happy thoughts of kittens and rainbows. It brings up critical, threatening questions.
Which perfectly sets up a very famous and frankly deeply misunderstood piece of research. When we talk about the extreme lengths people will go to in order to avoid their own thoughts, there's one study that is always cited. It's a 2014 study led by Timothy Wilson at the University of Virginia and Daniel Gilbert at Harvard.
The infamous shock study. I remember when this came out, the headlines were everywhere. The idea was that people would literally rather torture themselves than sit alone in a room.
Yes, that was the narrative.
Let's break down exactly how they did this, because the methodology is fascinating.
The researchers wanted to strip away all the external pacifiers we just talked about. They took participants, mostly college students initially, but later a broader demographic, and put them in a sparsely furnished, completely unadorned lab room.
Okay.
They took away all their belongings. No cell phones, no books, no pens or paper. The instructions were incredibly simple. Sit in your seat, stay awake, and entertain yourself with your own thoughts for a period of anywhere from 6 to 15 minutes.
Just sit and think. That was the only task. But then they introduced a variable that made this study legendary. They gave participants the opportunity to administer a mild electric shock to themselves during this thinking period.
Right.
Now, they had already tested this shock on the participants beforehand. The researchers actually asked them, would you pay money not to experience this shock again? And overwhelmingly, the participants said yes. It was genuinely unpleasant.
It was an established negative stimulus, and yet, when left alone in the quiet room for just 15 minutes?
The findings were staggering. The headline that went around the world was that nearly 70% of the men and 25% of the women chose to voluntarily press the button and shock themselves rather than just sit with their thoughts. One guy apparently shocked himself 190 times in 15 minutes.
Yeah, that outlier always gets mentioned.
The original conclusion drawn from this was incredibly bleak. The researchers suggested that people find their own spontaneous thoughts, their own minds, so inherently aversive and unpleasant that they would literally prefer to experience physical pain over mental solitude.
It is a dark conclusion. It suggests that human consciousness, at its baseline, is fundamentally a torture chamber when left to its own devices.
It really does. But here's where it gets so important for you listening, because that headline, while incredibly catchy, hides a much deeper, more nuanced truth. It isn't the whole story. I want to bring in the critical commentary published in Frontiers in Psychology by a group of researchers, Fox, Thompson, Andrews Hanna, and Christoph. They looked at the exact same data from the Wilson and Gilbert study and completely reframed it.
They basically said, hold on, let's actually look at the math and the self-reports before we declare humanity a lost cause.
Exactly.
This is where critical thinking is essential in a world of information overload. We have to look past the dramatic headline. What did Fox and her colleagues actually find when they dug into the data?
First of all, they pointed out a massive statistical reality that got buried. Yes, a minority of people shock themselves, but the vast majority of participants, 57% across all the trials, never shocked themselves at all. They just sat there.
Right, the majority did not shock themselves.
Second, and more importantly, after the 15 minutes were up, the participants were asked to rate the experience of just thinking on a 9-point scale of enjoyability. The average rating across all the studies was 5.21.
A 5.21 out of 9, meaning the average experience wasn't aversive or torturous at all. It was mathematically somewhat enjoyable.
Exactly. It was rated as somewhat entertaining and, yes, somewhat boring. But boredom is not the same thing as psychological torture.
That is a crucial distinction. Boredom is simply a lack of stimulation. Aversiveness is an active, painful repulsion.
And Fox's team went even further. They looked at the open-ended questions the researchers asked the specific participants who did shock themselves. They asked them, why did you press the button if you said you didn't like the shock?
And what did they say?
Out of the 18 people who self-administered the shock in that particular trial, 14 of them cited curiosity as their motivation. Not torture, not a desperate, agonizing escape from their own dark thoughts. Curiosity.
Wow.
They wanted to see what the shock felt like in that specific, quiet context. Or they were just pushing buttons in a sterile room to see what would happen to break the monotony.
They were exploring their environment much like a child touches a hot stove even after being told not to.
Yes. And when asked what they actually thought about during the 15 minutes, these subjects weren't describing agonizing existential dread. They reported thinking about weekend parties, sunny beach vacations, and upcoming holidays. Out of the 18 self-shockers, 12 reported explicitly positive, enjoyable thoughts. Only one single person mentioned boredom as a reason for the shock. No one reported that their thoughts were so negative they needed an electric shock to escape them.
What the data actually shows is a profound disconnect between how the study was framed for the media versus the reality of the human experience. Fox and her team used a brilliant analogy in their critique to explain why the original conclusion was a non sequitur.
Oh, the chocolate analogy.
Right. They compared it to chocolate. They argued that if you put people in a sterile room and force them to eat chocolate continuously for 15 minutes without stopping, eventually boredom, mild disgust, and a desire to stop would ensue. But you wouldn't conclude from that experiment that human beings find chocolate inherently aversive.
Right, you would just conclude that forced monotony is annoying.
You would conclude that doing anything continuously on command in a sterile lab environment without the ability to organically switch tasks eventually becomes uncomfortable. There are countless activities we enjoy spontaneously that become tedious when mandated.
So what does this all mean for you, the person listening right now, sitting alone in your car or your bedroom? The synthesis of all this science should actually make you feel a massive sense of relief. The science confirms that spontaneous thought, or mind wandering, is on average mildly pleasant. It is not an inherently aversive state. The discomfort you feel when the audio stops isn't because your mind is a terrible, scary place to be.
No, it is because we are simply unaccustomed to the vulnerability of the default mode network taking over without a clear objective. We are not used to the feeling of our own vast internal space. Think of it like stepping off a crowded, noisy, chaotic city street into an immense, echoing cathedral.
Oh, that's a great image.
The silence inside the cathedral isn't painful, but the sudden change in pressure, the sudden scale of the quiet, can be deeply disorienting until your ears adjust.
And that disorientation is exactly where our modern patterns start to emerge. Because instead of letting our ears adjust to the cathedral, instead of letting our DMN do its natural, healthy work of synthesizing our memories and future plans, we panic. We immediately pull out a flashlight, stare at a tiny spot on the wall, and look for an escape.
We reach for the phone.
Let's look at how this science actually lives in our daily behavior. What are the quiet patterns people fall into without ever noticing?
We can look right back to the home-based version of that same Wilson study for the answer. The researchers didn't just test college students in a sterile lab. They asked adults to do the exact same thing in the comfort of their own homes.
Sit alone, without devices, without books, for just 10 to 15 minutes.
Right. And the results were incredibly telling about our daily patterns.
Over 54% of the people essentially cheated when asked to sit alone at home. They couldn't do it for 10 minutes. They reached for their cell phones. They turned on music. They got up and started folding laundry, doing chores.
Because the home environment is completely filled with deeply ingrained habit loops of distraction, the pattern we all fall into is that modern technology provides instantaneous, low-effort dopamine hits. Over the last 15 years, we have conditioned ourselves to associate any gap in external stimulation with the immediate relief of a scream.
Yeah, we really have.
We no longer experience the natural pauses in our day, waiting in line at the grocery store, sitting in traffic, waiting for the coffee machine to brew. These used to be micro moments of mental stillness where the DMN could do brief, healthy processing.
Now, if a web page takes 3 seconds to load, we open a new tab to look at something else while we wait. We've completely eradicated the natural pauses.
We replace every single natural pause with constant curated content. And because we do this so consistently, the psychological muscle required to sit with our own thoughts has completely atrophied. When we are finally forced into a quiet moment, the DMN revs up, the evolutionary alarm system whispers that we are disconnected, and because we have no practice sitting with that slight discomfort, we panic and reach for the phone.
But there is another side to this, isn't there? Because sometimes we do get stuck in our heads. Sometimes the phone battery dies, or it's 3 a.m., the screen isn't helping, and you are forced to just lie there in the dark. And in those moments, it doesn't always feel like a pleasant cathedral. Sometimes it feels like a trap.
This is when we have to look at what happens when the processing goes wrong. It brings in the phenomenal work of researchers like the late Susan Nolan Hoeksema, who pioneered our understanding of how we process negative emotions. We have to break down what actually happens when we get stuck in our heads and distinguish between two very different mental processes, rumination and reflection.
I think understanding this distinction is life-changing. So if I'm lying awake at 3 a.m., replaying a fight I had with my partner, am I ruminating or reflecting? If rumination is just dwelling on the past, reflection must just be thinking positively about the future, right?
Not quite. It's actually not about positive versus negative thinking at all. It's about passive looping versus active engagement.
Okay, what does that mean?
Rumination, as defined by Nolan Hoeksema, is a persistent, repetitive, and passive focus on the causes and outcomes of a negative event. It is the mental loop. It is lying in bed, playing a conversation from 3 years ago over and over in your head, analyzing the tone of voice, imagining what you should have said.
The French call it l'esprit de l'escalier staircase wit. Thinking of the perfect comeback when you are already walking down the stairs to leave.
Right, exactly. Phenomenologically, rumination feels dull. It feels stagnant and heavy. It can be tinged with deep resentment and despair. And most importantly, it almost always stems from a lack of control or a wishful yearning for closure from someone else.
Like wanting an apology that's never going to come.
Yes, it is the desire for the other person to suddenly realize they were wrong, to apologize, to validate your perspective. It is giving your emotional power away to a past that cannot be changed.
Consider it this way. Rumination is like watching the exact same tragic movie on repeat, over and over again, desperately hoping that this time the ending changes. You know exactly what the characters are going to do, you know exactly how much it's going to hurt, but you keep hitting play because you feel like if you just watch it closely enough, if you analyze the background details, you'll figure out a way to alter the script. But you can't. You are just a passive observer to a painful memory.
That's a profound way to conceptualize it. It is passive observation of an unchangeable event, masquerading as problem solving. It feels like you are doing something important by thinking about it so hard, but you are actually just spinning your wheels in the mud, digging a deeper rut in your neural pathways.
So how does reflection differ from that?
Reflection is the antidote, and it has a quality of active engagement. While rumination asks, why is this happening to me? Reflection asks, what can I learn from this, and what can I do now? Reflection involves extracting new insights and, crucially, focusing exclusively on what is within your control moving forward.
Going back to the movie analogy, if rumination is watching the tragic movie on repeat, hoping the ending changes, reflection is turning off the TV, sitting down at a typewriter, and writing the sequel. It is taking the events of the first movie as immutable, unchangeable facts and deciding what the main character is going to do in the next scene to move forward.
Reflection empowers you. It takes the immense energy of the default mode network and channels it into active problem solving and future simulation rather than past regret recycling. If you find yourself in the quiet and you are analyzing a situation, ask yourself, is this the first time I've analyzed this? Am I extracting new meaning? Can I take action on this tomorrow?
And if the answer is yes,
If the answer is yes, you are reflecting. If the answer is no, if it's the 100th time you've played the loop and there is absolute nothing you can do to change the past event, you are ruminating.
and when you catch yourself ruminating, the strategy isn't to just think harder to solve it. It is to break the loop. The psychological term is cognitive diffusion. You have to literally disentangle your active awareness from the thought process.
And that can involve intentional distraction techniques, counting backward from 300 by threes, reciting the alphabet backward, doing anything that forces the working memory to engage in a neutral, slightly challenging task. This breaks the passive, repetitive loop of the DMN's rumination cycle.
But rumination isn't the only trap waiting in the quiet. Sometimes sitting in the silence doesn't bring up a specific memory or a fight. It just brings up a raw, heavy feeling. Sadness, grief, loneliness. And as a culture, we have a profound refusal to sit with sadness.
This is a critical piece of the human picture. We are simply not taught how to feel our feelings. When a difficult emotion bubbles up in the silence, maybe it's a feeling of professional rejection from a meeting that went poorly, or the quiet grief of a changing friendship, or just the heavy comparison we feel after scrolling through social media, our immediate instinct is to bury it. We numb it.
We use the three-word filters over our entire lives. I'm fine. Busy but good. Hanging in there.
But as trauma specialist Yolanda Renteria points out, when we don't pay attention to sadness, it doesn't just disappear. It goes into the basement and lifts weights. It comes out later as irritability, sudden anger, frustration, or a deep, lingering sense of being misunderstood. Suppressing an emotion actually exacerbates its power over us. Our feelings are messengers. There is always a story attached to why we feel the way we do.
But let's be honest. Feeling sadness is objectively awful. It hurts physically. It makes your chest tight and your throat ache.
Mm-hmm.
No one wants to voluntarily sit in an empty room and just feel sad. So how do we actually process this without just wallowing in it and ruining our whole day?
Renteria introduces a highly effective, trauma-informed practice called pendulation. It is the healthy practice of allowing an emotion to exist without letting it completely consume you. When you are alone and that sadness hits, you don't immediately grab your phone to numb it, but you also don't dive so deep into the sadness that you can't get out of bed for a week.
You pendulate, like a pendulum swinging back and forth. You dip your toe in, and then you pull it out.
You allow the sadness to exist in the room with you. You get curious about it. You might ask yourself, where do I actually feel this in my body? Is it in my stomach, my chest? What is this sadness trying to tell me? Is it just sadness or is it actually disappointment? You name the feeling without judging yourself for having it. And here's the underlying biological mechanism that makes this manageable. Neuroanatomist Jill Bolt-Taylor has found that the physiological lifespan of an emotion in the body and brain is about 90 seconds.
Wait, 90 seconds. That sounds way too short. When I'm sad for hours.
It sounds short, but let's look at the mechanics. When you have a thought that triggers an emotion, your limbic system, the emotional center of the brain, reacts. It dumps chemicals like cortisol or adrenaline into your bloodstream. Those chemicals create the physical sensation of the emotion, the racing heart, the tight chest, the heat in your face. But from the moment the limbic system is triggered, to the release of those chemicals, to the moment your circulatory system naturally flushes them out of your bloodstream, is roughly 90 seconds.
So the physical wave of the emotion only lasts a minute and a half. The reason I feel sad for hours is because I keep thinking new sad thoughts that re-trigger the limbic system, dumping a fresh batch of chemicals into my blood every 90 seconds. I'm keeping the loop alive.
That is exactly the mechanism. If you can simply observe the emotion, sit with the physical sensation of it without feeding it new ruminative thoughts, the intense, overwhelming wave of the emotion will begin to shift and pass in about a minute and a half.
So pendulation is surviving that 90-second physiological wave.
Oh.
You feel the heat in your chest, you let it wash over you, and then once you've honored it and let the chemicals flush, you swing the pendulum away. You safely distract yourself. You go for a walk, you call a friend, you watch a show. You don't have to live in the sadness forever, but you have to let it pass through the room.
You feel it, process the message it brought, and then move forward. That is how you sit with sadness in the quiet without letting it turn into a depressive spiral.
I want to stop the momentum right here for a second, because this is the most important part of this entire deep dive. If you are listening to this and you are realizing that you reach for your phone the literal second you are alone in an elevator, or if you overwork yourself to the point of exhaustion specifically to avoid the silence of a free evening, or if you constantly numb your internal narrative with external noise, I need you to hear this clearly. This behavior is not a flaw.
It is so important to reframe this away from the shame that usually surrounds this topic.
Yeah.
The societal narrative often tells us that if we can't sit quietly and meditate on a mountaintop for an hour, our attention spans are broken or we are spiritually deficient. That is simply not true.
You are not broken. You are human.
Remember the science we just discussed. Your brain is evolutionarily wired to associate isolation with danger. When the room goes quiet, your alarm system is doing exactly what it evolved to do to keep you alive. Furthermore, when the default mode network kicks in, it doesn't just ask easy, trivial questions. It asks terrifyingly honest, existential questions. Who am I really? Am I on the right path? Am I truly happy with the people in my life?
And avoiding those questions isn't a sign of weakness. It is a profound, deeply human protective mechanism. Facing the raw self in an empty room is objectively, psychologically harder than facing the external tasks of the world. It is 1,000 times easier to answer 100 work emails than to answer one honest question from your own soul.
The defense mechanisms you've built, the constant audio playing, the scrolling, the busy work, the packing your schedule with social events, they have protected you. They have kept you functioning in a world that demands constant output. Your desire to escape the quiet doesn't mean your brain is defective. It means your survival instincts are working perfectly.
Your behavior makes complete human sense. It is something to understand, not something to fix with a hammer. You don't need to shame yourself for reaching for the phone. You just need to get quietly curious about why you are doing it and what feeling you are trying to avoid.
And when we elevate this conversation, when we pull this idea upward to look at the deeper relational and societal layers, We see how this fear of our own company ripples out into every single aspect of our lives. Because the fear of being alone isn't just about screen time. It dictates our relationships, our careers, and even how we spend our money.
Let's explore that relational angle, because we so often confuse the physical state of being alone with the emotional state of being disconnected.
We must differentiate between loneliness and solitude. They are often used interchangeably in casual conversation, but psychologically they are radically different. Loneliness is a social emotion. It is a deep sense of disconnection, a feeling of not being seen, valued, or understood by others. You can feel profoundly lonely in a crowded room or while lying next to a partner in bed.
Loneliness is a feeling of deficiency. It's feeling like something vital is missing.
Solitude, on the other hand, is simply a physical state of being without company. It is a neutral, factual state. But because we fear the quiet, because we fear the DMN's honest questions, we conflate solitude with loneliness. We assume that if we are physically alone, we must be lonely, or that being alone means we are unloved. And that fundamental fear drives us into terrible life choices.
It drives us into the wrong relationships. We stay with partners who don't respect us, simply because the presence of another body in the house keeps the silence at bay.
It drives us to stay in bad jobs because the toxic culture at least provides a social anchor and constant distraction. And crucially, it drives relentless consumerism. We buy things to signal our worth to a tribe we aren't even sure we like, trying to buy our way into belonging. We use the presence of others or the distraction of tasks and money to anchor us, fearing that our worth is completely contingent on not being by ourselves. We treat solitude as a failure condition.
And this touches on something so core to what we explore here at Leone Patterns. We talk about money and resources not as numbers on a spreadsheet, but as human experiences. How we spend our money, our attention, and our time is intimately connected to what we are trying to avoid feeling. We treat our attention as a currency, and we willingly spend it on mindless distractions just to buy a temporary reprieve from our own minds. We literally finance our own avoidance.
And beneath all of that, beneath the fear of the wrong relationships, the frantic busy work, the consumerism there, is an even deeper, more primal fear that the silence forces us to confront. When we sit quietly, when we actually put our phone down and listen to the ticking of the clock, time moves differently. The silence forces us to confront impermanence.
That is the ultimate shadow hovering in the quiet room.
When you are alone, stripped of tasks and distractions, you are forced to realize that every conversation you have, every relationship you build, every phase of your life, and every moment you experience eventually ends. The external distractions mask the passage of time. The silence amplifies it.
It is the shadow of the fear of death, the ultimate ending. When we avoid solitude, we are often, at a subconscious level, avoiding the reality of our own finite nature.
And this is the beautiful, liberating turn of this entire concept within that shadow, is immense freedom.
How does facing impermanence give us freedom?
Think of the mind like a deep, expansive lake. On the surface, it is turbulent. The wind of daily life, the text messages, the news cycles, the social obligations, the financial stress, they whip the surface into a frenzy. It's noisy, it's chaotic, and it's constantly moving. If you only ever live on the surface of your mind, skipping from distraction to distraction like a stone across the water, you will constantly be tossed around by the fear of impermanence and the need for external validation.
But when you embrace solitude,
When you embrace intentional solitude, you are putting on a diving suit and descending beneath that turbulent surface. Yes, it is cold at first. Yes, the pressure builds. It requires immense courage to leave the noise behind and sink into the quiet. But as you descend deeper, beneath the crashing waves of the DMN's immediate anxieties and past ruminations, you reach the still, quiet, undisturbed depths of your own consciousness. And it is only down there, in the quiet, that you find genuine clarity. You find out what you actually value, independent of what society tells you to value.
you find out who you actually are when no one else is looking. You discover your authentic self.
And the ultimate paradox of all this, perhaps the most profound realization we can take away from the science of solitude, is that intentional solitude actually increases our capacity for empathy and human connection.
That seems entirely counterintuitive on its face. How does pulling away from people and sitting alone make us better with people?
Because the only support that lasts forever is the one we cultivate within ourselves. When you learn to tolerate your own discomfort in the quiet, when you can pendulate and sit with your own sadness for 90 seconds without running away, you cultivate profound emotional intelligence. You become intimately familiar with the landscape of human suffering, anxiety, and joy within your own mind.
And when you know your own internal landscape, you can recognize it in others. When a friend is grieving, you don't panic and try to fix them with a distraction because you know how to sit in the quiet with sadness.
Precisely. You stop using other people as pacifiers for your own anxiety. You stop clinging to relationships out of a fear of being alone, and you start choosing relationships out of genuine love, mutual respect, and shared values. By learning to stand alone, by becoming comfortable in the quiet depths of your own mind, you become a better, more authentic, more grounded companion to others. Solitude isn't isolation from humanity. It is the ultimate bridge to deeper human connection.
So let's just slow this right down and bring it all together. We've covered a tremendous amount of ground today.
We have. We've journeyed from the moment the car engine turns off to the subtle rush of the default mode network projecting our past and future onto the walls of our mind.
We've looked at the ancient evolutionary alarm bells that ring when the room goes quiet, tricking our nervous systems into thinking we are in danger because we are separated from the tribe. We've seen how the science, when you look past the dark headlines, proves that our own thoughts are not a torture chamber, but rather a space of mild, spontaneous wandering that we've just forgotten how to navigate.
We've explored the critical difference between the stagnant trap of rumination and the active, empowering freedom of reflection. And we've discussed the courage it takes to pendulate through our sadness for 90 seconds, honoring the emotion rather than burying it under a screen.
And most importantly, we've recognized the heavy, beautiful weight of impermanence. We've seen that avoiding the quiet is a profoundly human protective mechanism. You are not broken for reaching for your phone. It takes immense courage to sit with yourself without reaching for an escape.
I want to offer one final quiet thought for you to carry into your evening or your morning or wherever you are right now. The next time you feel that gnawing unease in an empty room, the next time the silence feels loud and your hand twitches for your phone, pause just for a second. Remember that this feeling is not a threat. It is an invitation to descend beneath the turbulent surface of the lake and meet the most important companion you will ever have, yourself.
If this conversation felt true for you, if something in here landed, we would love for you to subscribe to Leone Patterns so you never miss what we explore next. Leave a comment and tell us, what did this bring up for you? We read every single one. We are building a community here of people who think about money differently, not as a number to chase, but as a human experience to understand you are not alone in this. And we are genuinely glad you are here at Leone Patterns. Same pace, same questions. See you then.